Welcome everyone to the Academy of Ideas Education Forum. My name is Toby Marshall and I will be your chair for tonight's discussion. You can find out more about what I think about film education and film education at my blog, Toby's Jug, which is hosted by Substack. The title of tonight's discussion is After the Gove Revolution, how can state education be improved? And the Gove Revolution, part of this title is in quotations. And the reason for that is to acknowledge that this is most certainly a debate. Michael Gove hasn't been directly involved in state education for some time, but during his time in office, he most certainly did shift the debate for good or ill, putting both knowledge and the curriculum back on the English policy table. Gove, of course, had one view of the relationship between knowledge and the curriculum, and there are others. So tonight, I hope that we will discuss these perspectives, and I ask that we do so respectfully. Personally, I tend towards a liberal traditionalist view of education and the curriculum, but I also believe that the progressivist perspective, that of Dewey, Piaget, Brunner, and others, includes many important insights, especially at the level of pedagogy. So, knowledge always has a subject, and that's one of the things that the progressivists remind us. This session aims to explore in concrete and practical terms how English state education, which belongs to every citizen, I believe, might be improved for the benefit of the next generation. The blurb, because it was written by me, leans heavily on the question of knowledge and the curriculum, but this is only one aspect of the discussion. In our discussion, we might like to also consider other important issues, like the professional autonomy of state sector teachers, as well as their professional development. Questions like how are teachers to be educated might come up, and who should decide on the curriculum. These are issues I take very seriously as someone who's worked in the profession for more than 20 years, always within the state sector. Our panel for our discussion today is well placed to discuss all of this, and I'm very pleased that they accepted my invitation to speak. So I'm going to briefly introduce them in their speaking order. Speaking first, we'll have Alex Standish. I'm not quite sure on a digital environment whether they're on my left or on my right, but Alex Standish will be speaking first. And Alex is an associate professor of geography education at University College London, and he's the co-author of a fantastic publication, What Should Schools Teach? Disciplines, Subjects, and the Pursuit of Truth. Sarah Sesnilov is the strategic lead for learning and development at Big Education. And we're very pleased to have Sarah with us tonight. And this is a very successful multi-academy trust. Sarah is also an educational researcher, which is how I first came across Sarah's work, and a state school leader with considerable professional experience. I'm speaking after Sarah. We have Ian Mitchell. Ian is an English and psychology teacher with 20 years of teaching experience, and he's worked in the private and the state sector. So usefully brings us a comparative perspective, and he blogs at the website Secondary Ideas. Speaking last, we'll have Tim Oates. Tim is the Group Research Director at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. And we're very pleased to have him here tonight, as he was a leading figure in the formation of the fifth full version of the English National Curriculum, which was introduced by Gove more than 10 years ago. After the speaker introductions, which will last no more than 7 minutes, I'll go straight out to the digital floor. And I'd like to hear your questions, and I'd like to hear your challenges. And one of the traditions here at the Academy of Ideas Education Forum is we very much want a audience-led discussion. So please feel free to make any point that you wish. But in my mind, I'm thinking we might wish to organize our discussion into 3 sections. I think we need to account for the recent past. What has been achieved in the last 10 years? Are schools in a better or a worse state than they were under New Labour. Then we might want to look at the present, what's working and what isn't working, and why. And then, of course, a topic that's on everybody's mind, the future. How might we actually practically try and improve things? And do the proposed policy futures of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party offer us anything useful as a way forward? So, Alex, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thank you very much, Toby. I was very pleased to hear your introduction, because I am going to speak about the past, present, and hopefully the future as well. So, and I've got a list. I've got a list of kind of positives. I think that things that have improved over the last sort of 10 or 12 years. A list of negatives, and then I think things I'd like to see changed. But I'm going to reduce myself to just a couple of each, because for time's sake, but I'm sure others will come up along the way. Okay, so some positives I think that have changed in the last 10 or so years. I think with the new curriculum, we've seen increased content, demand, and rigor, especially with respect to content at GCSE and A level, and a lot more thought about Key Stage 3 as well, I think. Terminal exams have placed more responsibility on students for their own learning, understanding the material and passing the courses. So, and I think if you go into a lot of schools and you meet A-level students, a lot of them are very, very impressive. Okay, they're learning some great stuff, and that they're understanding, and they're very motivated. Just speaking to, I've got two daughters who've been through A-levels. One's just finishing now. Speaking to some of their friends, just chatting about EPQs, for example. You know, great discussions about, you know, somebody wanting to compare Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth in a discussion about who's Britain's best monarch. Someone else wanting to do a study on, is there a God? Just brilliant, you know, that these 17-year-olds would you know, take on these questions and immerse themselves in these kind of discussions. So some really positives if you meet young people and see their ambition and what they're achieving. A second positive then is that, as Toby mentioned, curriculum has become more of a focus in schools. There's more time dedicated to it, and more thought, particularly after 2017. So don't forget that Ofsted's turn to curriculum under the leadership of Amanda Spielman was very important here. So it's not just, it's a suite of reforms, really, not just the what happened with the national curriculum. But teachers are expected to write detailed curriculum plans now with clear rationale and a plan for progression of learning. You could say they were supposed to do that before, but clearly there is more of this going on, and I see a lot more planning, a lot more work in schools around curriculum. See some really excellent geography, Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 plans, where it's planned for coherence. We're talking, you know, disciplinary concepts are really explicit in the curriculum, and tied to substantive concepts in learning. So the whole sort of language, I think, around curriculum has changed, and I think, you know, teachers are taking this on board and planning some really great curricula for students. In terms of negatives, I think that there's a few things around sort of the culture of conformity, over divergent thinking, teaching to the test, memorization, over intellectual inquiry, the process of learning, which maybe Toby was alluding to as well. And, you know, at its worst, you know, we've got some schools are not actually creating their own curriculum, but you know, taking a curriculum off from someone else off the shelf and reproducing it. Sometimes reducing things to booklets, which, you know, maybe there's a creative way of doing that, but I see a lot of kind of fairly dull lessons, which are students filling things in rather than more creative teaching. So I think there's some problems around conformism and sort of top-down culture instead of and a lack of freedom for teachers to do things differently. My second negative is that I think sort of combining discussions around decolonizing the curriculum and also climate change catastrophism. Those might seem like quite different discussions, but Decolonizing the curriculum has really put, I think, schools on the defensive about their knowledge and their curriculum. It seems to suggest that, and not there's an interesting discussion to be had here. There is, but the suggestion that our institutions, our curriculum, are racist, I think, is not a fair one. Yes, it needs to be representative of all people in our country, but it has made the discussion around teaching Western culture, modernity, and the future more difficult. And climate change comes into that because young people we've seen are very worried about the future, and I think schools need to be positive. We need to be optimistic about the future and not think that our way of life is going to lead us to destruction. So I think that's a problematic discussion that needs to be addressed. So what to change? And finally, so just following on from that last point, I think a robust defense of academic knowledge for all which includes a defense of our culture, our values, and our way of life. So I don't think we can just kind of assert knowledge as, the curriculum needs to be about knowledge, but we think about some of the things that underpin a knowledge-based curriculum, and that is, our culture, our way of life, our values, and so I think we need to think about how we defend that better. I think any teacher coming into the profession needs to be positive about the past, because our knowledge is knowledge of the past coming into the present. They need to be positive about their culture, where we live, and also positive about the future, because you're talking about young people's future, and there's no good going to schools telling everybody that we're all doomed, because that won't endear you to the young people in front of you. Okay, so that's my first thing. And then secondly, I guess related to my other point, more space for teachers and pupils to think differently. A space for space for creativity, a space for a bit more professionalism, and room within schools to challenge conformism. Because I hear teachers saying that it's quite difficult to put your hand up and object to things. Some of these discussions I've alluded to above. And I'd like to see, I think we see some really excellent schools out there, sort of coming back to my first point. But I think it's quite a mixed picture. So I'd like to think of ways we can get some of those better schools to share their practice and their ambition, both in terms of the curriculum and in terms of intellectual inquiry, and particularly challenge assumptions around class. I think we still see quite a divided curriculum, this school's for that type of child and this school's for that type of child, and there are schools doing that. There've been lots of new schools in London. I think London has gone a long way to sort of challenging that, and obviously it's one of the best performing regions. So how can we move that beyond London to raise the aspirations for all schools around the country? That's me. Thank you.
Alex, thank you very much. Sarah.
Thank you. So I work for Big Education, and we take a more expansive view of what education could and should be for students. So it's probably going to be no surprise to you that I am going to take issue with Gove's legacy, and I'm going to talk about some problems with the knowledge-rich curriculum, some consequences of that, and some possible solutions. So problems, first of all, there are, as has been alluded to before, there have always been long-standing debates about what knowledge matters in the curriculum, and it's been taken by Gove to be the best that's been thought and said. The issue for me with this is that will always take a naturally elitist slant, and it will privilege a white colonial advantage narrative. Who decides what's important? There have been years of work by academics on this, and it's not a fully resolved argument. I don't think it's something that should be decided by politicians. It should be decided by education experts. Who's to say that Wordsworth is more worthy of study than slam poetry? Who's to say that Gainsborough is more worthy of study than Damien Hirst? Don't all of those have equal value? And if access to that kind of privileged knowledge is the only way for children from deprived backgrounds to succeed, then maybe we need to change the system, change the narrative and not the students. You know, the Black Lives Matters movement and moves for gender and disability equality have always been about changing the system rather than making people fit into the current system. Problem number 2, what about responding to community need? So I think different communities need different kinds of knowledge. The curriculum at School 360, where I'm head teacher, is built on social justice in terms of diversity and environmental justice because of the multicultural urban community we serve. Who's to decide what's important for the diverse sets of families and communities we serve across England? I would argue that the curriculum and the knowledge we select needs to be tailored to local need. And for me, that's not about limiting learning. It's about enabling community potential. Problem number 3, the knowledge-rich curriculum has been taken to be facts, and rote learning has become prioritised in tests like the GCSEs, like the spelling and grammar test, like the times table check. Knowledge is so much more than facts. Knowledge of matters, but knowledge how and knowledge to is equally important. As the digital revolution takes place, most countries in the world are moving away from an education system where the indicator of success is the memorization of facts towards the importance of the kinds of skills we need children and young people to have to navigate the world. And employers also want that kind of person. We need to be teaching critical thinking so that students can discriminate between the ever more complex and contradictory sets of facts they get on the internet. We need to be teaching them creativity, which Alex mentioned. As AI reduces career opportunities in many fields, creative jobs continue to flourish. We need to teach them communication, face-to-face and in writing via multiple formats. Facts need to be handled and presented in ways that persuade and convince. Problem number 4, the straitjacket of subject knowledge divisions. I can see that in universities, subject disciplines and those divisions really matter, although there is increasingly, even in universities, a recognition that we need to learn and work in interdisciplinary ways. Those courses are becoming more popular, and we have a new university in London called the London Interdisciplinary School. I can see, therefore, that A-level students do need those subject divisions, especially if they're being funneled up into a university course. But then if we bump down to the early years, we don't have subject boundaries there. We know that knowledge is more fluid, and a single activity might cover several different areas of learning, and rightly so. The problem is in the middle. Do subject divisions really matter at primary and secondary age? A project-based or topic-based curriculum approach has lots of advantages. It actually helps children remember and make connections between different areas of learning. That's actually what a knowledge-rich curriculum values. It's very difficult to do this right now because you're penalised by the inspection system with its focus on deep dives in subject areas. So because of these problems, we've got some unintended consequences. The attainment gap is not narrowing. I would say, are we measuring the wrong things? It's a little bit like Ofsted reform. Do we need more of a sort of report card that shows the full breadth of pupil skills beyond just memorising facts within subject disciplines? We need to stop relying on tests of memory as ways of measuring success. We've got a huge attendance crisis, which has been very closely linked to mental health and anxiety. School is boring and exams make students anxious. The current system builds in opportunities for failure thanks to the reliance on that single measure of memorising facts. We've got a teacher retention crisis. The curriculum's so packed full of statutory knowledge-focused content, teachers don't have the space to teach according to their passions or to teach according to the passions of pupils they teach. There's so many tests and so much test preparation required. There's no space to simply enjoy learning. And very few other countries have as many high stakes tests as we do, certainly not the high performing ones. I think what we need to do is recognise that knowledge of and knowledge how and to can be taught together. Subject matter can remain important, but it can be combined to make learning more powerful. Other competencies matter too: creativity, collaboration, resilience, metacognition. For leaders, we need to really address the damage that the deep dives have done. These naturally preference certain curriculum approaches, and we've lost the importance of pedagogy and child development in the quality of education judgment. And that really matters, and that matters for subject teaching. For teachers, we need to stop testing the memorisation of facts through statutory tests. We need to divert the huge amount of spend we have on teaching to providing professional development for teachers so that they can design really rich curriculum experiences and reduce the national curriculum content so there's more space for skills development. For pupils, I think we need to let the principle of choice underpin curriculum design. Pupils should be able to learn through and be examined on topics that extend beyond traditional school subjects or combine several different fields. Let them leave school with a portfolio instead of a test score to showcase the breadth of their learning. So in summary, I think we need to be bold and design a curriculum for a changing world. And I'm hoping that's what any future politicians will be presenting to us. Our world is changing really fast, but in England, we're moving backwards.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Ian. Ian, you're muted.
Okay. I thought you were doing that. Thanks. So good evening. Thank you for the invite, Toby. Now, actually, unlike Sarah, my perspective is quite narrow. I mean, teaching A-levels. Now, I argue this evening that education, especially secondary schools, can be improved when teachers and other stakeholders establish a consensus of what they are ultimately trying to achieve and what education is for. And that, I think, should take into account a long-term view. What sort of individuals do you want to cultivate for when they become 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds and beyond? Not just what are your exam results. Also, very importantly, what is not your functional purpose? What very strictly do we not do as teachers? What do I think of a curriculum in which we have knowledge for the sake of knowledge, one in which we teach the best of what has been thought and said? Well, I'd like to give it a proper go, which is a flippant way of saying that I don't think we have had a knowledge-based curriculum exactly, certainly not since Michael Gove's reforms. I don't say that that's his fault, mind you. One of my points is that perhaps teachers do not have enough of a consensus about what they are for. Having said that, the Gove revolution, as it's called, for me, wasn't as clear in what it was trying to achieve as it's often given credit for. It was about a knowledge-rich curriculum, lots of content. You can see that from the newer exam specs. But it was also about making exams and grading more rigorous. And I don't think they're the same thing. If there is a core value which unites all teachers and underpins secondary education, academically speaking, I think it's the belief that grades matter above most other things, and that teachers are as accountable for the grade outcomes as the students who sit the exams. Whilst grades obviously matter, they become undermined paradoxically when you overemphasize their importance. If teachers can very directly influence grades by explicit instruction of learners, then I actually think exams become devalued. So A-levels should be about something which is between the learner and what they study, not predominantly about how well teachers space out their testing, useful though that sort of thing might be. But we all seem to pay lip service to the influence of teachers on grades to the detriment of the pleasure and journey of teaching and learning. As a brief anecdote to sort of try to give an example of what I mean. A friend of a friend, 20 years old, is talking to me about English literature A-level. Informs me, got a B grade. And I ask, which text did you study? Couldn't remember. And I said, well, you must have studied a Shakespeare. Yes, was the answer, but can't remember which one. It's 2 years after, remember, studying these. Now, in the end, we worked out it was Othello that the student studied. What this former student did recall was assessment objective 2 in more detail than I would know it as a teacher. And I think you'd find a commonality here. Teachers now know the specifications as well as their subject. Students know the assessment objectives as well as they know the content. English literature's demise in popularity as an A-level option is interesting to me because I think Mr. Gove intended for it to be more valued after his reforms. He wanted students to read Middlemarch and the like. But the challenge of English literature is a subject where you really have to read the source texts and find an independent way of engaging with them. There are no shortcuts unless you're going to use your notes all the time. The subjects where popularity has soared are the textbook ones, ones that can be taught via a textbook. The ones where so-called knowledge can be disseminated into little bite-sized chunks to ensure safe exam grades. And I don't think that's a coincidence. The knowledge-led curriculum is being undermined by a belief amongst many that it's a teacher's job to get you a high grade, which is the real point of academic study. A knowledge-led curriculum, if that's what we all want, needs a very tight ring fence. Now, I read a lot of studies in my job about the effectiveness of mental illness treatments, CBT and medication, that sort of thing. One of the common issues is whether such treatments are any good over 10 years or more, because not many researchers look at that. And similarly in education, we don't seem to think much about what a successfully schooled child will look like at 20 or 30 or older. Why not? Because arguably we are too obsessed with measuring outcomes than we are achieving them. A thought that struck me: if the instructional methods of teaching exam content are so good, we should soon see in our profession many of our students returning as graduates, full of knowledge and critical thinking, ready to pass on the best that's been thought and said to the next generation. Too early to know. We'll see. Maybe they will. But at the moment, there are more graduates than ever, especially in the humanities subjects, and there's a recruitment and retention crisis problem in teaching. To summarise, teachers need a consensus. I think it should be knowledge-based, and it should have a much longer list of don'ts than do's. And for now, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Tim.
Great. Okay. Lots of very, very important contrasting perspectives. I want to add a bit to Alex's introduction in terms of history. I want to respond to quite a few of the points, actually, kind of naturally, through the things that I've prepared in this very brief introduction. I think we just need to go back to England in the 1970s and 1980s. Prior to the existence of a national curriculum, very few countries had a national curriculum at that point. France had one, Finland had one, but very, very few countries had one. Now, almost every country has one, high performing or not. There's something about the importance of codifying and stating a socially agreed body of content to which all kids should have access. And it's that last idea of all children having access which drives national curriculum thinking in a lot of nations. And I think that's very important for equity. In the 70s and 80s in this country, we had massive variation in outcomes just by area and region. And most attempts to do something about that had failed. And it wasn't simply to do with contrasts and types of schools. There was incredibly diverse practice, which resulted in extraordinarily diverse outcomes and inequalities. And it's there in the data. So we had a national curriculum in '88, and because it was the only show in town, it was incredibly overloaded. Deering did a first check of that in '95 and did a content reduction. Second content reduction was done in '99, and that was really strongly endorsed by the teaching profession. Then something slightly odd happened in 2007. We had a very, very, very slimmed down national curriculum, to the point where all the key concepts in agreed areas of knowledge had suddenly disappeared. And science went from a large but at that point manageable specification to something which had very little conceptual content. That's why I would argue quite strongly that the change which was introduced in the 2010 review and 2014 national curriculum wasn't a revolution at all. In one very important sense, and a second sense that I'll come on to in a moment, it just wasn't a revolution. It was a return to that trajectory of a carefully managed process of refinement. And why have a national curriculum? And what form should it take? They're important questions. The why, I hope I've already very briefly answered. It genuinely is about equity. The what then becomes heavily contested. How big and what content? That's inevitable. It inevitably will be contested because the process of constructing new knowledge is a process of contestation. So we need to think, is this a total map of human knowledge? No, not in my view at all. What is it? It's a carefully curated body of foundational knowledge for developing young people. And that's why Alex's references to coherence within the curriculum are vital. Bill Schmidt's senses of curriculum coherence, things which are stated in effective and empirically grounded progressions so that each thing builds on the next in the use of metaphor or the understanding of kinetic energy. But that's history. Where are we now? We're in an interesting state. Our standards have gone up. We know that from PISA 2018, 2022. In aggregate, inequalities were reducing prior to COVID. But really, a lot of the things that we were really focusing on and consolidating were severely disrupted by COVID. And I've written extensively about the extent to which COVID effect will be present in the education system until the mid-2030s at least. You know, kids born during COVID, many of them had quite significant challenges developmentally. Now, just rushing through the rationale around knowledge rich, I mean, if we, as I said, not a revolution in my view. Why this emphasis on knowledge? Well, it is partially a pendulum swing, and it was a pendulum swing in respect of this very stripped down, in my view, far too stripped down national curriculum that was there and presented to Parliament in 2007. There was a strong view that subject knowledge needed to be reinstated. Now, I think key points have been made in the presentation so far about you can have that aim, but you can implement it in such a way that does damage on the ground. And I think we always need to pay attention to the distinction between policy aspirations and practical impact. But the aspiration was to return to carefully curated and stated bodies of knowledge, which made sense in respect of foundational knowledge for young people. Now, I would argue, and argued right the way through that time, that we were very aware of false oppositions. You know, knowledge versus skills, theory versus practice, concepts versus application, didactics versus pedagogy, thinking versus action, teacher-led versus learner-led, disciplines versus cross-curricular, facts versus creativity. They're all false oppositions. You know, if you want human capability, then education needs to contain all of those dimensions, all of those elements. There then comes a question of balance, and always you run the risk of curriculum overload because of contestation. But why knowledge rich? Well, I mean, knowledge, if we think of the rhetoric of the left during the 1930s, the majority of the thinkers, educational thinkers, wanted the privileged knowledge of the elite to be available to all. You know, powerful knowledge is a key phrase that's been consolidated in educational discourse by Michael Young, and rightly so. It was the left, the progressives, those interested in equity, that recognized, in my view, that knowledge should play a vital part in education and is vital to progression. Not independent of application, not independent of action or practice, of course not, but it should be there. Why? Well, knowledge is yours. You own it. If you know something, it is yours. Just as skills, if you have skill, it is yours. You own it. Now, remember, this is very much the territory of labor activism for centuries. The idea that the proletariat should own these important things, and they own them, and those things should be recognized and they should be well remunerated. and they should allow social progression and access to power and authority in institutions. So a couple more minutes and I'll finish. So I think we have improved. I don't think it was particularly revolutionary. There were some very backwards looking elements of the thinking. We tried not to ensure that those weren't too dominant in the curriculum, but at the same time we have to acknowledge that there are issues about tradition in culture, which other cultures around the world strongly value. If you think of Native Americans, for them, their history is vital. Their preceding culture is really important to them. And those are perspectives, again, which we need to keep in mind when we're devising a foundational curriculum for young people. And to finish, what about improvement? What can we do? Well, standards are up in reading and mathematics. We still got real issues about SEND. SEND policy is very underdeveloped. Key stage 3 remains wilderness. We've got real problems of primary, secondary transition. And we've got very strong COVID impact. We've got problems of teacher workforce, and we've got problems of workload. Are there remedies to that? And are there remedies to false oppositions? Remedies to false oppositions, knowledge, skills, learning, and so on, didactics, pedagogy. We need to look at the science of teaching, but we also need to look at learning dispositions. We've got excellent science from Ruth Deacon-Crick on learning dispositions. We know they're strongly predictive of outcomes. You need to be well disposed towards learning. We need to improve the role of formative assessment. Relatively formal, a massive kind that you have in Finland, but its purpose is to improve learning. Its purpose is to provide feedback. Its purpose is to engage young people. We've got to harness social learning far more. The notion that learning should be exclusively personalized and individualized runs contrary to what we know about high quality pedagogy. So we have to reduce teachers' workloads. We have to acknowledge what is fundamental to the profession. We have to reduce the end assessment burden, but teachers themselves say not by increasing the amount of non-examined assessment, because that is very burdensome to them. We have to think about shorter formal assessment, the role that the knowledge from formative assessment can be accumulated. This notion of accumulated credit, not like the States, I've done it, I've forgotten it, I put it on one side, but accumulated credit. So knowledge builds through the progressions Alex described. That's been well described in some systems and has been well underpinned by assessment theorists. Portfolios have been used before, by the way. Portfolios are mentioned, and they've had a very, very checkered history, and do not seem to unlock progression.
Thank you, Tim. Can I go out to the floor soon?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the final point.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you.
And the final point on my piece of paper is this. I've said not certain forms of personalization. We know that certain forms of personalization actually increase inequalities rather than decreasing them, because they don't utilize social learning and they don't attend to the problems of the cultural influences on children from out with the school environment.
Brilliant. Tim, thank you very much. Okay, fabulous. If people could put up their hands if they'd like to speak. I mean, a couple of things I'd kind of pick out from the comments. I'm very interested in Alex and his point about some of the underpinning problems. So I'm intrigued to know whether people think that the problems or in what ways are the problems that we confront today different from 10 years ago. So have things changed, and what might those new problems be? But also what strikes me is particularly important is the question of boundaries. How do we differentiate between what is educational and what isn't educational, what's legitimate to do within schools? And one of the things I'm concerned with is the degree to which the autonomy of students is kind of respected, because that seems to be a big issue at the moment. Drive from both the left and the right to want to use education to inculcate certain values. I'm just interested in the question of autonomy in relation to that. So, Joanna Williams, did you want to make a comment or ask a question?
Yeah, both really. I was really taken by the point that Ian was making about teachers, the extent to which teachers are presented almost as solely responsible for the exam grades that the students get. I mean, to kind of almost more of an extent than the students themselves. And that really just chimes with my experience and strikes me as being absolutely true. I guess I think you can see this to a very interesting extent, even in the nature of exam questions. If you go back over a substantial amount of time, the kinds of questions that students were being asked, certainly in humanities subjects, were not the kind that you could teach to directly. It seems to me far more open-ended exams, and there was no way that the teacher could direct students' learning to such an extent that you could teach to the test in that way. So I guess my question is really, when and why, and has this transition of the change in the teacher's responsibility taken place? And obviously it has a comparable impact on students, where students are presumably to certainly up to the age of 16, it seems to me, to GCSE level, kind of more infantilized. Their learning is directed to that much more of an extent. They're not having the opportunity to become kind of go off piste and become independent and responsible for their own learning to that extent. I guess, what I would like to see in the future is teachers being more humble, or encouraged to see themselves as more humble in relation to student achievement and exam results. Teachers are not responsible for all of this. Students must be encouraged to have some agency and take responsibility for their own learning. But I'd also like to see teachers become more arrogant in relation to subject knowledge. To go back to the points that Sarah was making, I think teachers should be the people who decide what is the best that has been thought and said. I think that's a useful guiding principle as far as I'm concerned, but that's a conversation that teachers should see themselves as sufficiently expert and kind of more arrogant about their own subject knowledge in being able to make those decisions. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Joanna. Linda, did you want to come in there? Linda?
Yes, yes, I can hear you.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I would. I wanted to take up some of the points that both Ian made and Tim made, and Alex as well. It seems from what I'm not up to date with the success of Gove's reforms, and you seem to suggest that they haven't really worked out. And I wondered in what way. I mean, Tim made several points about he has slimmed everything down, did he? I thought he had reintroduced, because when I was at school, in a working class area, I have to say, of London, we were taught the best that has been thought and written, and we lapped it up and enjoyed it immensely. But after that, obviously, when I went into teaching later, what was taught was the English curriculum became an adjunct to sociology, actually, rather than a separate subject in itself. But as far as I'm concerned, knowledge is absolutely vital, and I would agree with Tim that the national curriculum is important to codify a body of content to which all pupils should be allowed access, because knowledge is power. And that is the essential thing as far as I'm concerned. That was why I lapped up knowledge at secondary school, even at primary school, and look back with great gratitude for it. But it sounds as if some of you don't agree with that at all. And I went through all sorts of strange things when I was teaching, such as Mode 3, which allowed children to write, all sorts of strange things, which in fact were probably written for parents by their parents at home. I mean, there was all sorts of things that were corrupting the curriculum, and you have to make sure it doesn't get corrupted by parental invasion. But anyway, I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you, Linda. Harley, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, please. Couple of things. I recall going to a conference, a knowledge conference of educators who were in the knowledge movement a couple of years after the Gove revolution began. And I remember very clearly that talking about the need to, there was a lot of work to be done to persuade the public, the teaching profession more generally, that knowledge was a good thing, even though Gove was making his big changes. And the reaction, pretty much universal reaction, was, "Hey, we've won. We've won. Knowledge is here to stay." And it feels like actually they may have won the battle, but they didn't win the war, and we're probably about to find that out in a big way if Labour get into power. So it feels like, was the knowledge movement complacent? Is the first question, and secondly, just to picking up on Sarah and the comment about, I'd like to stand up for the best that's been thought and known. As Sarah asked, who's to say whether Wordsworth is better than slam poetry? Well, quite a few people would say that Wordsworth's better than slam poetry. I don't think that slam poetry has demonstrated that it deserves a place in the canon yet. It may well do that, and it may be for you to persuade me that it deserves that, or someone else. But I think there's some, it's not a given. And the comment, I can't remember your exact phrase, Sarah, about the canon being sort of white Western privilege. Well, yes, but it has that universal aspect, and it's appealed to many people. People who aren't white and aren't Western have found great things in the canon. That's why those great works are there, and that's why it's, for some other piece of work to unsettle them and demonstrate to us all that it's better and deserving of a place there.
Thanks. I think I'll bring the panel back in at that point if they'd like to come back in. I think Harley raises I think really interesting issue, which is there a consensus over knowledge being central to education, or was it simply the case that a Conservative government imposed that, and did they win the argument over that? Are we having a debate? Is there a fundamental debate here going on over different visions of what the purpose of education might be, or is this more a discussion about the different means by which those knowledge objectives might be achieved? So, Tim, did you were responding a bit there, and I'll come to you as well, Sarah. Tim, what were your thoughts on that? I mean, was the argument actually won, or was it just imposed?
I think, yeah, really interesting. I'd like to just respond to Linda. Linda, what I was saying is that in '88 we had an overloaded national curriculum. It was slimmed, just managed in '95 and '99, but essentially was the same. Had the same essential approach to specifying subjects. There was then an odd version of a national curriculum in 2007, which stripped all the content out, and then the 2010 review and the 2014 national curriculum, which is now in place, is on a line of development from those earlier versions of the national curriculum. So in that sense, Gove's reforms weren't a revolution. They were actually another step along a road which had been established much earlier, of a subject-based curriculum with subject progressions and some refinements in terms of how a primary curriculum was stated year by year rather than just by key stages. And the evidence is that in terms of the big transnational surveys, PISA in particular, that standards have gone up. So it does represent a general improvement for the system. That doesn't mean there aren't aspects that there aren't aspects which can be improved. And we've heard some aspects of the calls for that improvement. So that's very important to recognise. Could it all be reversed? Oh, by the way, there are other issues. I've written something which will be published shortly about there was much less revolution than one might think. Academisation, That came from pre-2010. Emphasis on phonics in reading, pre-2010. I mean, there's a long, long list. There were some things which were a radical change, but they were far fewer than the things that represented a doubling down or a continuity of what was laid down during the New Labour years, interestingly enough. And I think that's very important to recognise. Otherwise, the potential is that we'll move to a position like Scotland or Wales, of a very doctrinaire philosophy driving the curriculum. And in Scotland, what we've seen is a reduction of standards and
yes.
an increasing of inequalities, and in a very serious way, because of in my view, a lack of grip on the value of discipline knowledge at the heart of the curriculum.
Yes. Can I add that your reference to phonics, that came under Mrs. Thatcher, didn't it?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
right.
And that was nothing to do with New
L-
Labour. Let me add, the 2007, of
Linda,
course.
could I bring
Labour
Sarah in at this
reforms.
point?
Sorry?
Linda, would you mind if I bring Sarah in at this point?
No.
Sarah,
Okay.
thank you. You're muted, Sarah.
I want to come back to Tim's
Lovely, thank you.
word, which is false oppositions. And I really like that term because, you know, people would like to call me probably a progressive, but I don't like to be labelled as that myself. And I'm not a person who thinks that knowledge is not important. I think it's really, really important. I think what we've got is, first of all, we've got a gap between what was intended and the actual practice that we see inside schools. And for me, that's partly to do with the testing regime, that the lady who was talking about removing open-ended exam questions, making it easier to measure with shorter chunks, which basically reduces it to memorization. That's really problematic. And the deep dive similarly have reduced schools to a sort of panic about curriculum content coverage to the exclusion of lots of other things. So that's my issue with it. And in terms of, you know, the best that's been thought and said, Harley, I totally agree. Wordsworth is really great. But I think, why can't we do and instead of or? Why can't we have both kinds of things for every kid that really benefited from learning Wordsworth and really got into English and loved it and went on to study at university? There's another kid that felt really excluded and felt that that kind of material was really irrelevant to them. And if they had a unit on slam poetry, maybe that would have been the thing that got them into poetry. So for me, it's not, it's this like concept of false oppositions. It's not about or, it's about and. It's about enriching the curriculum rather than taking things away.
Okay, thank you. Alex, did you want to comment at that point? We can come back later.
Hi, yeah, no, it's fine. I think sort of picking up on something that both Tim and Ian said, well, Tim called it ownership of knowledge, and Ian was talking about the successful child and what that looks like. And this relates to sort of how far we've had success. You know, so Gert Biester says that education is for qualifications, socialization, and subjectification. And so, you know, we're doing qualifications fairly well. Where you know, socialization happens apart from during lockdown, but subjectification is about the development of the individual, and he has the phrase, the world comes into us and we go out into the world. And that's where, yeah, you take ownership of the knowledge. It becomes part of who you are. It really, you know, it starts to be how you see the world, how you interact with the world. We talk about disciplines, disciplinary knowledge as, you know, lenses through which we or a toolkit that we take on and we use to interpret, engage with the world, and it does change you. It changes who you are. So that's what we mean by subjectification, and that's the bit I think that's you know, not really doing well. You know, schools are good, teachers are good at often at doing what they're told. You know, and this is where the sort of top down thing comes in. But so I think you know, we've got a system that's working relatively well, you know, despite some of the limitations around teaching to the test and you know, not giving students enough ownership for their own success. But I think, you know, the question is what's behind that. If exam system, you know, if those legs were kicked away, you know, do we really have a commitment to the culture, the traditions within, you know, within English, history, mathematics, geography? Do we have a commitment to the traditions, or are people more focused on sort of social problems and the present? You know, I'm less sure about that. So that's where I think the discussion around the value of culture and the sort of discussions we're having about, you know, what is great poetry. I think those discussions are really important, and how they you know, help to transform the individual into somebody who you know, has those capacities, that power to see the world differently and change their lives for the better.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I mean, I just wonder whether it is feeling maybe a little bit cozy, because I mean, sometimes a lot of the, I mean, I do think there's been a great achievements and we've moved forward, but there is also massive contestation over values within education. There's an increasing sense of kind of culture wars being fought out through education, and the authority of the teacher seems very much challenged at the moment. I'm very interested in how we might reconstitute that in some way. Martin, did you want to come in at that point?
Hello. Can you hear me there? Yeah,
I can hear you. Yeah.
Thank you. There's enjoying the chat so far. There's a lot I could talk about, but one thing I want to focus on really, I think, is when we're talking about the best that's been thought and said, and we could argue about that till the cows come home, but the idea of cultural transmission, the importance of culture, the importance of nationhood or tradition, all these different things. One thing Gove has done over the last few years, or sorry, the Conservatives have done since Gove, is preside over a complete collapse of arts education in schools. Something which, not complete collapse, but a hell of a collapse. Certainly in numbers taking exams, numbers of being taught the subjects in schools, and the qualitative nature of the way it's being taught as well. So I think that is something which is a disgrace, really, and something that when we talk about a knowledge-rich curriculum, when we talk about breadth in the curriculum, it's something that needs to be addressed urgently.
Thank you. Ian, I just realised I forgot to come back to you as well. Did you want to say anything at this point? And then I'll go to Hilary.
Yes, just to come back on a couple of the points that were made. Joe mentioned about the teachers and responsibility for grades and so on. One of the things that is most likely to get you a job if you're working at exam level is, have you been an examiner? Now you think about that. Why should that matter? What does being an examiner give you over another graduate who's going for a job as a teacher? And it's because you get inside information on how to get those little chunks of information and what to say. And I mean, that's a problem. When Tim was saying about, well, what needs to change, that we need to do something about that. And the second thing, and this picks up on something Linda said, what didn't work out? Well, it's the obsession with data, mindless numerical data, predicted grades. You know, it's this obsession with, we've got to measure everything. Like there's nothing valuable about education unless you can stick a number on it. And I think this is another thing that's got to be really thought about here. And I don't want content stripped back. I want all the other functions that teachers are expected to do stripped back. You know, I want them doing a couple of things really well, which involves the focus on what teaching and learning is. And it is about this knowledge-based focus in the end, I think, for me, the curriculum. I do believe that a canon can be devised, but that's what you need, that focus, I think. And I like the word arrogant that was mentioned. Teachers should be more arrogant. We do this really well. We don't do that and that. Go away, bother somebody else with it. And I think they need to be more like that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Hilary, did you want to come in at that point?
Yeah, so I confess not to be an expert in any of these areas, but somebody mentioned this is what employers want. So I just thought I might come in and say, speaking as an employer, this is what I want, just to kind of inform the debate from that that angle. And you know, leaving aside the very obvious like maths and English, the things that I need people to be better at than they are at the moment is, first of all, discipline. And that's around kids not believing that the world should be built around them, but to know how to fit in with the world. And that's not kind of to discourage that innovative thinking in the workplace. It's more because people need to understand their individual and their collective role in getting work done. And to some extent, I kind of agree with Sarah that, you know, whatever content works with different kids, to get them to do that, you know, I think to some extent it is a bit content neutral. But the thing is, I think that leads on to my second point, which is that the other thing we really need them to understand is their connection to the world and how they fit in with the world. And I don't think they just get that from engaging with things they're already familiar with. And that's why I think they need the kind of canon that people have been talking about, so they understand the history and the you know, the way that they fit in with their nation and their community, and you know, the business world as well. And then the third thing I've just mentioned is independent study. Now that sounds a bit highfalutin when you're talking about some people who are, you know, doing, you know, very important but you know, relatively basic admin work. But the way that those people develop in the workplace and move on to the next steps is by doing things like reading around the subject, and that means just going home and reading a book. And a lot of the young people we have never read a book. You know, they've never read a book from cover to cover. And saying to them, "You really enjoy this, take it home, borrow it," you know, and that's some of the things that kind of bring me up short about some of the kind of problems I see in education as an employer.
Thank you, Hilary. I mean, I think that raises a kind of really interesting thing to maybe think about, which is, to what extent have we, I mean, and teachers confront both at the same time. Have we got a problem of socialization or a problem of education? Is it the case that we've kind of made great strides in education, but we're also right now confronting some very serious problems of socialization, you know, partly associated with lockdown and all of those things. Tim, I will come back to you in a second if I could just take a few more people, but thank you. Gareth, did you want to come in there?
Yeah,
what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Toby, and thanks for organising what I'm certainly think is a fascinating discussion this evening. Some really, really brilliant points coming out. Look, I just wanted to, before I get to my sort of question, I just wanted to fill in, you know, what people often forget, which is what comes after that Arnold quote, that contested Arnold quote, I might add, about, you know, the best that's thought and known, or the best that's thought and said, depending on which edition of Culture and Anarchy you read. You know, in that, he goes on to talk about learning the best that has been thought and said, to almost sort of turn it on itself with fresh and new thinking, I think he calls it, to question you know, existing thoughts, existing ideas, and it sort of characterizes to me this kind of the two poles of this, where we've got the pro-knowledge camp saying we must teach fundamental knowledge, and then the critique of that being, yeah, but where's the sort of freshness and the creativity and the free thought and the questioning and all of that. And what I think has happened with the Gove revolution is that the importance of both of those sides has just completely dropped out. Like, Sarah's critique, I think, was really, really good at sort of summing up, you know, the boundaries of that fundamental knowledge. But what it misses out, I think, is the fact that if you don't have that fundamental knowledge, which is what Tim was saying was the point of those reforms, if you don't have that, you can't have the free thought that questions anything. You're just sort of floating about in a vacuum of your own ideas. So you need fundamental thought. So my sort of challenge really is, you know, I think, as I say, Sarah did a really good job of mapping out the ideological division between what those proponents of foundational knowledge want and the critique of that. She did a really good job of sketching out those divisions. Why do we not hear this from Labour going into the election, which is what we're supposed to be talking about here. You know, why are all the ideological divisions not being talked about? And it all sort of reduces to technical questions about how we, you know, might make a sort of technical change here or a technical change there, or, you know, new type of qualification or something like that. Why are we not getting at the ideological divisions, which Sarah's done, as I say, a really good job at making clear are really, really present?
So Gareth, yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. I think maybe it starts taking us to, you know, the question of the election. I think you're right. I mean, I looked at the pre-election or kind of pre-manifestos from the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, and so it strikes me that what the Labour Party is proposing is to reorganize the curriculum, to rewrite the curriculum around what I take to be a political principle of diversity, and also an economic principle of kind of utility and emphasis on skill. And I looked at what the Conservatives are saying, and the Conservatives, which I think is interesting, just don't appear to have anything to say at the moment about knowledge and the curriculum and education. It's very, very narrow. COVID catch-up fund, special educational needs, which I think is really important, you know, and very valuable. But that's not a vision of education, is it? That's you know, I wouldn't say a narrow thing. It's a very important thing, but that's not the entire cohort. It doesn't seem that the Conservatives at the moment have a rival vision to the Labour Party on education, which I'm finding very interesting. Could I just got three new hands? If I could just bring people in there, Gregor.
Thanks. Mine is a brief observation. There were some points that were made about teaching the arts. I'm an art teacher, and the national curriculum specification in art is basically half a side of A4. When you think about what the English or mathematics specification or history would look like, it's a lot more than that, as I know you all know. And yet what we find in art, one way that you could interpret that is that we have enormous freedom. Here are just a few basic points, and they're good points, I think, that are made in the national curriculum. We have enormous freedom, and yet what I find is that among my art teacher colleagues, we're drawn in to teaching to the test. We're drawn in to a bureaucratized approach towards education. If you're thinking to yourself, how could you possibly teach to the test in art? I hate to tell you that I could tell you how to do it, and I know many people who do, and I think I wanted to make that point because I've been really struck by the quality of conversation from all different sides this evening, and there's obviously some key differences, some key divisions. Often I find myself thinking that that's the most interesting thing to explore, is to probe those divisions. But I've got to say tonight, I'm really interested in the way in which there seems to be fresh and new thinking. To go back to Gareth's, coming from all sides, that desire for fresh and new thinking, that desire to give teachers the autonomy, to trust teachers to teach, rather than do all these other diversionary things. It strikes me that there's an interesting opportunities for those who might find themselves opposed ideologically in some of these debates to make common cause for teaching as against, for example, some of the more bureaucratizing and data-driven approaches to teaching that we found ourselves saddled with.
That's interesting. Nico, did you want to make a point?
Yeah, I was just stimulated partly by Hilary Salt's point about the importance of independent working and employees. And I've observed that, I don't know whether this is new, and I don't know whether this is the domain of education per se, but that independent working and being proactive is not as common among employees, you know, who've come out of, well, university mainly, as it might be. And there's a tendency to be permission seeking rather than taking initiative. or even just asking a question about, how do I do this, or should I be doing that, or why are we doing this, or whatever. And it's very frustrating as an employer to, be, having to be kind of constantly telling people what to do rather than having them, kind of take action and ask questions later, as some people say. And I wonder if that's a phenomenon. Maybe it's a phenomenon of teaching to the test. Maybe it's a phenomenon of a kind of approach to pedagogy that doesn't encourage people to be, as Hilary talked about, being independent and taking initiative.
Thank you. I'll bring the panel back in a second. If I could just ask them to have a think about if they could identify one or two for them, what the one or two kind of key problems within the state sector that need to be addressed. Maybe then, because we all are kind of agreeing quite a lot here, or it appears that we're agreeing, but maybe if we prioritize what we think the key problems are, one or two key problems within the state sector, maybe that'll bring out some of the differences. Is that Ms. Lipson? Would you like to make a point?
Thank
Hi.
you. Hi. I work in a secondary school that is as successful as it is because it's a kind of product of the changes that have happened under the kind of Gove revolution. It is so much more professional. The work of teachers and the professional development, the culture, and yet at my school, the motto and the thing that we endlessly say to children is that they're climbing their own personal mountain to the very best universities and professions. There is no sense that education is a good in itself. There's no sense that education is about freedom. And Michael Gove, I think he and Gibb packaged their revolution as knowledge rich, but what they were really seeking was a return to liberal education, which is the legacy of our history, and was widespread, certainly for the lucky few that went to grammar schools until very, very recently in our history. And while knowledge rich may have been a useful kind of way of packaging the changes he wanted to see, and it has been effective, perhaps we've got to the point where it is also now reductive and it needs repackaging as what it ultimately was always supposed to be, which was a return to liberal education. Yeah. And that's the failure thus far of this movement to evolve into that liberal movement is partly compounded by the fact that the term liberal education has been so successfully confused with its polar opposite of progressive education. So people within the knowledge movement, some of the most vociferous pro-knowledge people, refuse to refer to themselves as liberal educators, as people pursuing liberal education, because that term has become so kind of unmoored. And I think it's time that Gove's knowledge movement evolved to where it is supposed to be going. But unfortunately, we are so unmoored from the classical liberal education tradition. There is one free school that uses the term. Toby Young was bold enough to use that term somewhere on a website if you dig deep enough. But otherwise, very few, as far as I know, no state schools use it. There's a couple of elite private schools that have dabbled, but they certainly don't use that term. And then where you find it most, and I have discovered this with utter fascination as a parent more recently, is in the homeschooling world. There are incredible curriculums that you can buy from the US. And if you're prepared to educate at home, you can pass on a truly incredible classical liberal education.
That's very interesting. I'll just throw something out, and this might be completely wrong, but just for a thought: is it is the key polarity traditionalists versus progressives, or those that are instrumental in their view of education against those that are non-instrumental? Because there's a possible alliance there between the traditionalists and the progressives in the sense of being against an instrumental view of education as serving a social purpose or socialization. I'm just, interested whether that's a possible alliance. I don't know, because it's certainly the case that education is viewed in a very kind of technocratic and instrumental kind of way. But Sarah, did you want to come back in at that point? Just any comments? You're muted at the moment.
Just going back to comments by Hilary and Gareth and Nico, and what is the issue in the system. So, and this idea of unintended consequences. So this idea of teachers focusing on teaching facts and memorization, I think is partly, and we talked about the size of the curriculum, is partly to do with there being too much detail in terms of how much needs to be taught in the national curriculum. So if you think of the example of Japan, for example, who has really, really high results in mathematics for primary schools, they have something like 60 to 70% of the actual knowledge content that we have in our mathematics curriculum for primary schools in England. And what that means is they can teach with depth rather than coverage. And they can also do what I'm working on with a group of schools across the UK at the moment, which is looking at the sorts of teaching competencies that someone like Hilary is looking for in the workplace. So we're working with someone at MIT who's developing competency progressions for things like metacognition, for things like creativity. And if teachers were treated as, I can't remember what someone called them, was it experts? I can't remember the term earlier. If teachers were given back that ability to be experts, they could create really carefully crafted units which do build in content knowledge, like the best that's been thought and said, but also as part of those units of work, teach progression in those competencies that we want young people to have when they go to university, when they move into the workplace, and then when they become citizens of the world, because I think those things are really important. I think it is possible to have both, but you need to stop testing memorization of facts, and you do need to reduce some of the content in the curriculum to enable more creativity and skills teaching around the handling of knowledge and the way we are as the students are as learners, or could become to be as learners.
Excellent. Alex, are you a citizen of the world? Are you anywhere or somewhere?
Anywhere or somewhere. I'm definitely somewhere at the moment. I guess I wanted your challenge, Toby, was about what changes should we make. So at a practical level, I'd like to throw out all the PowerPoint presentations.
I just delivered my first one today.
And strip back some of the planning to I guess more medium-term plans. So really good medium-term plans which sketch out where the curriculum journeys, the progression models, but let teachers need to plan their own lessons. Okay, teachers need to plan their own lessons, take responsibility for that, and take it through. Because if they're teaching someone else's lesson, loads of people read off PowerPoints. It's just, that's not education, is it? So I think we need to let teachers take ownership. If I can bring in one more point that hasn't been talked about yet, is universities. Well, we maybe touched on universities, but I guess something that worries me is what what young people are learning at universities, particularly in the social sciences. I think it's a bit different in in the hard sciences, but in social sciences, certainly knowledge is not well in universities, and a lot of courses, as you probably are aware, are more focused on activism, challenging the system, or taking on environmental challenges. So again, sort of coming back to my early point about culture, that if you're a product of that system, then you are interested in the social challenges, social justice we face, but that doesn't necessarily lend itself to going into school to pass on knowledge to young people. So I wonder if that speaks to the recruitment crisis we're having, that we're not instilling in young people a sufficient love of their subject. At university, I'm talking about sort of love of their subjects, a love of knowledge that then inspires them to want to go on and pass that on to young people. Just to say, Ms. Lipson, brilliant defence of liberal education there. Thank you very much for that. And yeah, we definitely need more of that.
Great. Ian.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, the first thing that I'd say that would probably need to stop talking about is the idea that money on its own going into education will solve all the problems. And I'm not aware of any example in any field, in any walk of life, where you can just throw money at something and that will sort everything out. You need to know what you're doing and why you're doing it before you think about what you're going to spend. There's a lot of chat about in education about this idea that money will solve all the problems. What do we want to achieve? And it comes back to what I said originally. I'd like to add something else, that coming back to what Gareth was saying, and I introduced the Arnold quote, a bite-sized chunk, in fact, that I was criticising later on in my talk. So he's got me there. He's absolutely right. I've sort of decontextualised that. But if a liberal education is so good, it will be so good that politicians won't be able to tamper with it. They won't dare, or they won't feel the need, and it will be a defence of its own. And on the concept of defence, something struck me in a news story the last day or so, which was about how some of these conspiracy theories about Kate Middleton had come from, tampering by foreign, malicious, media and so on. And I thought, well, it seems to me a good defense against that kind of thing, against that sort of fake news culture, is critical thinking. You got critical thinking. It doesn't matter what it goes into your news feeds, because you wouldn't believe it unless you had good reason to. So it just seems to me that you will know things have got better when there's a real sense it's strong and it stands for something and it means something and people know what it means. So much so it will be apolitical, because there'll be no room for politics. There'll be no vacuum to fill. Thank you.
Excellent. Tim.
Thank you. And I'll respond to your question by picking up a few of the points I think that were made. I emphasise this not a revolution, which I strongly feel. The rhetoric of revolution is and the idea of strongly emphasising knowledge rich. It was a particular period of educational history. And I mentioned this issue, the idea of inappropriate pendulum swings. I mean, the idea that it's a return to a long tradition of liberal education in this country is absolutely right. And if you overemphasize the extent to which the national curriculum changes for 2014 were a break with the past, you're opening up yet again a dysfunctional pendulum swing. Linked to that, the key points made about this, the size of the curriculum in Japan in relation to mathematics. One of the things that drove the 2014 national curriculum were transnational comparisons, and the idea that primary should be characterized by fewer things and greater depth. Now, it is right, I think, that the national curriculum is reviewed after 10 years, and we're coming up for that now. And there are some elements of the current national curriculum which I think can be challenged as being overload and actually prejudicial to fewer things in greater depth and therefore greater equality. Two final points. I think if we let's just argue that the over-reductive converse, that it would be a really good idea if kids knew fewer things. That sounds really odd, and you begin to think, no, actually, for progression, for personal satisfaction, for understanding the world, knowledge is critical. And if you can make distinctions, find distinctions in language between disinterested and uninterested, between diffraction and diffusion, if you make those fine distinctions in language, you can also make fine conceptual distinctions. And the kind of conceptual distinctions are absolutely essential for work, whether that in science or in any other area. So that begins to pick up the motivation for what lay behind what was characterized as knowledge rich. I think the points that have been made this evening about the reductivism which is introduced by assessment, that's absolutely bang on. Memorization is important because, again, in Japan, memorization is seen as a foundation for understanding. Memorization by itself would be derided in that society. It is for a purpose. It is to gain understanding. That's where a lot of the reductive memorization for the purposes of assessment has taken us to a dysfunctional place in terms of the classroom. And Alex raised the point about the need for teachers to engage in curriculum construction. I mean, that was Lawrence Stenhouse's work here in Cambridge, the idea of curriculum formation at the level of the school and at the level of the classroom. That is extremely important, that level of curriculum formation. That's why we distinguish the national curriculum and the school curriculum in the 2010 reforms. And it is absolutely the case that the Amanda Spielman want to focus on what that process of curriculum formation is in schools, and is particularly in schools that are successful. I want kids to understand a term like metaphor. Now that can be learned through many different references to particular bodies of literature or particular authors or particular works. So there's in terms of curriculum formation at the level of the classroom, there's lots that you can do. There's lots of variation. There's lots of adaptation you can do to the needs of your kids. But I think a national curriculum should say that all kids should understand the idea of metaphor. Just like in science, in biology, they should understand the concept of cell motility, even though you can explain that through bacteria or epithelial cells. Again, there's variety and opportunity, and to turn it into a school, a classroom reality which appeals to your kids. Scotland is disastrous, and that has just emphasized the idea of rich learning experiences with no attention to knowledge progressions, or to the precision of language, or to the precision of conceptual formation. And we just see the standards decline year after year after year after year. And it's well beyond the claim about teething problems that we've heard from north of the border. So I agree with the points about reductivism. I agree with memorization being useless by itself, but it's essential for understanding. And I think we need, as this idea of really drilling to the core of what we mean by liberal education, I think that was a great contribution.
Thank you. Okay, do we have any final points or questions? We might be drawing to a close here. I've got Nico. Anybody else want to make any final observations? And I've got Harley. Anybody else? Okay. So Harley, then Nico.
Oh, you caught me out there. I'm really glad that I think Miss Lipscomb, I think it was, brought up that point about liberal education. It's an area of particular interest to mine, but it has been nagging at me that what people from, I'm not a teacher, but I'm a parent, and I'm interested in education, work in education publishing. And often what I've heard about how knowledge-rich schools are run, and sort of scripted lessons and so on, it sometimes feels like a bit of a caricature of a liberal education rather than liberal education. And just thinking about why people have sort of steered away from the idea of a liberal education. It used to be common coin up till certainly I think the 1970s, but has got, you don't hear it much these days. And I think it's something to do with the fact that it's all about freedom and intellectual freedom and human freedom. And historically, liberal education was something that only a few people could have. It was really the elites who got access to it, and everyone else, they got a very limited education. We're going to teach them just enough so that they can read the Bible, etc., etc., whatever it would have been. And people fought to get access to that liberal education. It took a long time, and we never completely got there. But for women and working people, it was a big thing. And part of that was convincing themselves and convincing the society that their freedom was worth taking seriously, because they might do good things with it. Whereas the attitude up to then has been, these people are just not worth it. Don't give them an education, they'll get ideas above their station. And I kind of wonder whether we're back in something like that now, because everywhere you turn, people on both sides, traditionalists, progressives, are all about, education is for this. It's to produce people who are job ready. It's to produce children who are social warriors or have a certain political outlook, or this, that, and the other. And it doesn't feel like freedom is a big part of that, thinking, well, this is a really good education. If we give that to children, who knows what they'll do with it? Let's see, because we've got faith that faith in people, faith in education, faith that something good might come out of that.
Excellent, thank you, Nico.
Yeah, just briefly, I want to pick up on something that's been in the news in the last couple of years, which is the idea of oracy, which I don't think we've discussed. But in July last year, Keir Starmer or Bridget Phillipson gave a speech to the Shadow Education Secretary, saying that Labour will announce a review of the national curriculum that will seek to weave oracy into lessons throughout schools, and also place a greater emphasis on music and the arts. And more recently, the Oracy Commission has been launched in the last month or so, which will examine the vital skills of speaking and listening at a time of unprecedented technological and social change. And I would be interested to know what some of our esteemed speakers' views of the idea of oracy are. On the one hand, pupils being able to express themselves and be articulate and arrange their thinking and so on, fits in with some of the things that have been said. On the other hand, you might see it as being something of a fad or something of a non-educational discipline. So I'd be interested in any thoughts people had.
Okay, brilliant. So I'm going to Tim, I'll bring everyone back at the end in reverse order, and speakers, if you'd like to comment on this, don't feel that you have to, but I'd just be interested partly what your thoughts are about where we're at in terms of the relationship between education and politics in our society at the moment. I mean, a general election is a great opportunity for us as citizens who are educators and teachers, to try and stimulate some kind of national discussion. But I'd be interested in your kind of reflections on where you think we are nationally in England, at least, in the relationship between education and politics and our discussion, because there doesn't. I mean, Blair came in on education, and significant things happened under Blair. Gove came in with a mission. Not everyone agreed with that, but there was a debate, sometimes an angry debate, but there was a debate and a discussion about education. I'm just wondering whether it's just me, but it doesn't appear to be much of an educational discussion happening as we lead it into this general election, and how we might stimulate that. But just before I bring the speakers back in, if I could just make a few announcements. If you would like to, please subscribe to the Academy of Ideas Education Forum subscription list, and then you can get notifications of future discussions. And our next one is on religious education, and that's on the 25th of April, or religion and education, and it's called Faith Schools, Prayer Bands and Images of Muhammad in the Classroom. And what man better than Kevin Rooney to chair one of those? So that's on the 25th of April. And also, I'd like to draw your attention to the Battle of Ideas. And there's going to be a series of education discussions at the Battle of Ideas. And that's on the 19th and 20th of October. And there's an early bird ticket available at this moment in time. So you can book yourself in there. So speakers, come back on anything or just make your final statements. Please address yourself to anything you like. Tim, final thoughts.
Okay, Oracy. I think it's great that the commission has been launched. I think it's unfortunate that people don't read the aims, the subject aim statements in the 2014 national curriculum. I mean, I included in each one of those aim statements in mathematics, in science, in English, the emphasis of rich oral exchange in the classroom about content and ideas. And Lucy Crehan is brilliant on this in terms of in Cleverlands when she talks about classrooms in Japan, in Asian settings, the extent to which there is rich Q&A, which involves each and every child. No child can hide from the richness of the discussion, which involves them exposing their ideas and looking at misconceptions and so on. I think it's absolutely vital. I think a lot of the models of personalization of learning, which we're hearing from tech companies, actually remove that vital aspect of social learning from schooling. I think it's a real problem. So ROC, absolutely yes, and the evidence is very strongly in favour of it. Education and Toby, a great education politics. I mean, my take would be there's a problem, there's a tension within the political establishment and within the various party manifesto formation groups. On the one hand, they want to have ideologically loaded discussion, which enables them to put clear blue water between themselves and another party. And but on the other hand, the current group of politicians are in education are quite sophisticated. They know that increasingly we have accumulating evidence about what works and what is important in terms of approaches in science, approaches in reading and so on. Importance of phonics is a case in point. And actually that evidence points to a lot of continuity in education policy, which is kind of inconvenient for the very high level of conflict and contestation which the parties want to introduce for the purposes of election discourse. So I think that's the reality where we are now. The final thing I'll end on is Hannah Arendt, or Hannah Arendt. You know, The Crisis of Education, 1952, brilliant paper. One of the things she said is that the education, contradictory for somebody with left leanings, education should be highly conservative. And by that she meant if we're going to raise the next generation of people who will form society, and they will form that society critical of inequalities, critical of our incapacity to deal with things like conflict, then education itself shouldn't be total, because that's indoctrination. It should be conservative in as much as it should give the fundamental essentials for children to become critical members of society. And I think that paper remains for me an extremely important insight into what liberal progressive education should consist of.
Thank you, Tim. Brilliant. Ian. Have we lost Ian?
Yeah, it's all right. I've done that again.
Oh,
I'm back on. In terms of the political situation, all I can really think is that I'm not sure Labour know what they want to do yet with education. And I don't think the Conservatives think they'll have to worry, and I think they're probably right. The paper I read, which was about alluding to education that Labour Party have released, it just talks quite worryingly in metaphorical terms about boundaries, and I don't really feel there's any sense of anything concrete as yet, but I dare say they will try to do something. And it tends to be around, their focus seems to be around the idea that education can somehow engineer social mobility, and can level things up, and I'm just not sure any direct attempts to do that will be successful. I just don't think that's what education is for. I think education could help in an indirect way. We've talked, the word equity has been used tonight, and I think it can be very powerful in that way. But I think if you try to use it for those ends, I think you cause more problems than you solve. And I return to a point I've made about the whole idea of the post 2010 era, that whatever happens, there needs to be a consensus, and teachers need to agree what they're doing and why they're doing it, and have a very clear sense of that. And I don't feel there's much of that from the teachers I talk to, or working generally. But what there is some excellent methodological practice in the classroom. I think that's more innovative than I've ever seen. But in terms of what are we trying to achieve, what are we doing, I don't think there is a consensus. And I think that if you've got that, it can become apolitical. The politics, to some extent, is pushed to one side. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sarah, you're muted at the moment.
Every time. Yeah, I don't see much coming out in terms of educational policy from either side. I think going back to Gove, it was deeply damaging, Gove's view of people who disagree with him and dismissing the kind of the blob of education. That trend remains in terms of the Conservative Party, and I think that's been really problematic. And I think we're in a situation now where educators feel really disconnected from politics at the moment, that they are not really listened to unless they're one of the kind of hand-picked favourites of the government. But although there aren't any sort of policies out there from the Labour Party that we can really look at and critique, I think there are a lot of discussions behind the scenes. And to be honest, going back to Tim's word, conservative, I think that's what we need. We need a long-term vision rather than quick fix policies that just tinker around the edges with things that have gone wrong in education. So I think it's okay to be cautious. I think we're in a very difficult position at the moment, and what it really needs is some really deep thought before we start looking at short-term policies that will make people happy and look good, but won't actually tackle some of the deep standing problems that we currently have in the education system.
Thank you, Sarah. Alex, final thoughts.
Thank you, and thank you, Toby, for organising this debate, and picking up on what Sarah was just saying. Isn't it wonderful that we've brought people together with very different perspectives, and I'd say we've had quite a lot of agreement across our different positions, and isn't that what we would like to see more of in this election? Because it does seem like the moment that there isn't much meat on the bones of the policy proposals. It doesn't seem like, maybe it'll change. Maybe things will pick up. But I guess for a while now, I've been concerned about the lack of teachers' voice in terms of driving change. It seems like there's a lot of. Seems like we sort of wait around for Rishi Sunak or somebody else to come up with a new idea for Key Stage 5, and then it gets rejected, debated. But it's why are not teachers taking a lead on what they think are the important things that need to be changed? And maybe one of the reasons is the unions, because unfortunately I think unions aren't what they used to be. I have been involved in the past in a university union, and it just seems like they've some of them at least have kind of lost the plot a bit, and don't really sort of stand up for the sort of things that I think are important in education. So yeah, maybe we need more. We need new vehicles, new ways of coming together. But certainly, it would be great to see some mechanisms by which great leaders in our schools can and higher education can have a voice for positive change. you know, as I said earlier, I can point to some great schools that I go to in London, and it'd be wonderful to see them sort of, you know, speaking up and you know, sharing ideas about things that could be really positive for change in you know, in schools and education moving forward. So anyway, thank you again, Toby, and yeah, more of the same, please.
Okay, can we thank our speakers, please?